There are few smartphones as fondly remembered as those from the Google Nexus line, and there were a lot of them made in the early days by a variety of manufacturers, with each model often feeling completely unique from the previous. The LG Nexus 4 from 2012 and the LG Nexus 5 from 2013 were fairly similar in design, but then in 2014, well, to say Google went a different direction would be a wild understatement. This is the Motorola Nexus 6, an absolute unit of a smartphone that hit right in the heyday of the phablet market. It felt ridiculously big with its 6-inch display, all amplified by the bold, plastic, and distinctly Motorola-esque design, not at all dissimilar to their Moto X phones. The major difference was this was a Google Nexus, which meant clean, stock, unbloated Android 5 lollipop with updates to Android 7 Nougat, making for one of the most pure, unfiltered, and immersive Android experiences money could buy back in 2014. Hey, how's it going? I'm Josh from 91Tech, and it's been over a decade since the Motorola Nexus 6 was released. So I think it's a good time to ask the question, how does it hold up all these years later? The Google Nexus line is iconic, but it wasn't without its issues, namely inconsistency, as Google jumping from manufacturer to manufacturer led to potentially ostracizing their already limited consumer base on any given year. The Nexus 4 was a smash hit, so it makes sense Google went with LG again for the Nexus 5 the next year. But then of course in 2014 Google went all in on Motorola with the Nexus 6, as we got basically the definition of a phablet. It was priced as a high-end flagship starting at $650 for the 32GB model, and $700 for 64 gigs. There was no expandable memory, which was unfortunately the norm for Nexus phones despite the often plastic builds. Adjusted for inflation, $650 becomes just under $900 now, putting it roughly on par with a modern flagship smartphone for some perspective. Competing with the likes of the Samsung Galaxy Note 4 and the iPhone 6 Plus, the Nexus 6 needed to do a lot to be worth purchasing. After all, users on previous Nexus phones like the 4 or the 5 might be more inclined to stick with their current device rather than migrating to an immensely larger form factor. So let's start with the design, which is one of the more unique aspects of the Nexus 6 and certainly the one that stands out the most. This phone doesn't really feel like a Nexus, it feels like a Motorola, and depending on the type of user you were a decade ago, that could either be very good or very not so good. If there is one word to describe this phone, it's big. Big design, big display, big power, you name it. The display is easily its most striking element. You're looking at a 5.96-inch AMOLED panel with fairly thin bezels relatively for the time. The asymmetrical bottom bezel being thinner than the top bezel gives the phone that very obvious Motorola look from the front, and I don't know how I feel about it to be honest. On one hand, no physical home button, so you might as well make that bottom bezel as thin as you can, but the asymmetry does make the phone feel a little bit off compared to at least say the next year's Nexus 6P, which we've looked at in a previous video and we'll do a little bit of comparison with later on. And things can always be worse, like the first Pixel from 2016 with its huge empty white bezels. From the front, I would take the Nexus 6 any day of the week. We've got front-firing stereo speakers, which was quite the rarity for a 2014 smartphone, and made for probably one of the best speaker setups on any phone ever made to this point. I'm not huge on the speaker grill protrusion, as it just doesn't look very clean, but the raised profile does provide some practical benefit, as it helps protect the screen when the phone is placed face down. That bright 6-inch screen itself is not only AMOLED, but 1440p, with a pixel density of 493 pixels per inch. It's pretty darn impressive, especially for a non-Samsung phone of the era, and while burn-in can absolutely happen and isn't uncommon on any older OLED device, so long as you don't leave the screen on a static image for too long, you're probably fine. The colors here are very vivid and really pop. The whites feel almost blindingly bright with this pre-dark mode Android software, though it wouldn't be hard to customize that to your liking with a little effort. Using this phone isn't exactly what I would consider comfortable, as someone with hands probably a bit on the smaller side. My main driver is the iPhone 15 Pro Max, so I do regularly use a large phone, but the Nexus 6 is noticeably wider, making it extremely cumbersome. If Google had a Nexus 6 and Nexus 6 Plus sort of situation like Apple had just introduced in 2014 with their iPhones, this wouldn't be a problem, but the Nexus 6 came out by itself, standalone. And while the 5-inch Nexus 5 would continue to be sold on the Google Play Store until March 2015, this phone being this big really limited its potential audience in 2014. I mean, even over a decade later, this phone is ridiculously huge. That's fine for those who like it, but not having any smaller option was just a strange choice in my opinion. Heck, the iPhone 6 Plus had a 5.5-inch display, the Note 4 5.7 inches. This phone is significantly harder to wield than both of those devices. And with Apple or Samsung, you always still had the option of going with the Galaxy S5 or the smaller iPhone 6. The Nexus 6 was big and bold, and whether or not that was a good or bad thing depends on how big you wanted your smartphone 10, 11 years ago. I do personally think it's just too big, but it is easy to tell Motorola tried to account for the size as we examined the rest of the design. We've got this thin, contoured, and sturdy aluminum frame that feels premium to the touch, along with a curved matte plastic back cover. I really appreciate the actual aluminum frame here rather than just painting some plastic chrome. Not looking at anyone in particular, Samsung. The big centered camera sensor has no bump to it, which is nice, and the shiny Nexus wordmark and Motorola logo contrast nicely with the dark blue plastic. There's a bit of an inset to both the big M and the camera lens. It's fairly unique, but very Motorola, and I mean, look at the Moto X 2nd gen, and it's basically the same phone, exactly, front to back, just missing the Nexus wordmark. Seriously, the phone is identical, it's crazy, and I feel like that does take away a lot of how unique this phone still feels. It doesn't make the Nexus 6 bad, it just feels a little bit lazy. Colors came in midnight blue and cloud white, so not too much variety, but I do really like the shade of the midnight blue model I have here. The entire back of the phone has a pretty substantial curvature to it, which was no doubt done to make the phone feel a little bit more comfortable in the hand, but the phone is still quite thick at its center, and it feels a little bit slippery to me too, certainly not helped by how much I just need to readjust the phone in my hand to actually use it. Again, it's just too darn big, at least for being the only size option. No fingerprint reader is quite disappointing. That would come the next year, so on this phone you would be typing in your passcode the old-fashioned way if you wanted any level of security. Or doing one of those patterns, those could be fun. We've got this nice textured power button and smooth volume rockers on the right side of the phone, which are all thankfully low enough to make this easy to reach. On the top of the device we've got the SIM tray, and no, your eyes do not deceive you. That is in fact the glorious forbidden headphone jack, instantly putting this phone above any Google device made after the first Pixel, no question about it. On the bottom of the phone we've got the micro USB charging port, and you can see the classic scratches around it, as the previous users no doubt struggled to jam that charger in upside down who knows how many times. USB-C would come in the next year's Nexus models, thankfully, but for 2014 this was still very much the standard. We did have turbocharging functionality, which apparently promised 6 hours of usage after only 15 minutes plugged in. Pretty impressive, and we also have Qi wireless charging, which is really nice to see on a phone this old, and a big benefit of the plastic build. Now of course after all these years you'd be hard-pressed to find a phone that doesn't have a significantly degraded battery, unless you've replaced it, and unfortunately despite the plastic there's no easy way to just take off the back panel and swap the battery. It's not the most difficult process ever, but apparently it does involve removing 22 screws once you pop it open, so I'll pass. The battery itself is 3200 mAh, which was sizable for 2014 and should have easily gotten you a day of use. That's one benefit of the size for sure, but again, over time batteries degrade, so it wasn't providing me great performance anymore. I always like to look at old reviews when I'm reviewing these phones just to see how people viewed the device back when it first came out. And it's kind of amusing to see all the articles talk about how this phone doesn't bend, as this was seen as a very legitimate positive back in 2014 given the whole iPhone 6 Plus Bendigate controversy. But thankfully, you'd be hard-pressed to actually bend this absolute unit out of shape. The aluminum frame, plastic backing, and overall thickness makes this closer to a brick than anything else. I can understand why some might find the design appealing, but I think it's just a bit too much for me, as much as I can appreciate that old Motorola style. The size, the bulk, the curvature, it's definitely an acquired taste. And most of these phones do show a lot of wear and tear over the years, with scratches and the paint fading. Apparently that logo can also be peeled off, which feels a little cheap. All in all, this design compared to the next year's Huawei Nexus 6P, I mean, for me personally, it's hardly a competition, but we'll come back to that shortly. First, let's talk about the hardware and the cameras. Powered by the Snapdragon 805 processor with 3 gigs of RAM, the Nexus 6 was absolutely capable of competing with the best smartphones available a decade ago, no problem, boosted by its unbloated, clean Android software. At this point, its latest version of Android 7 Nougat definitely feels its age, and it looks pretty old, but it's still capable enough for the basics, and with Android, it's not hard to download plenty of modern apps even on this ancient software. Now, if you actually try to use the Nexus 6 all these years later, the performance is fine when just swiping around the user interface, but it does slow down pretty quickly with anything more intensive like internet browsing, or whatever might take some more power. It's not that bad, but it is old. I definitely wouldn't want to use one of these phones anymore, but it's still fun enough for the novelty, and with the big 6-inch display, headphone jack, plus those booming speakers, it probably would be a half-decent media streaming device, I guess. Now with software this old, the security would definitely be a concern, and you will probably find some app compatibility issues, but never fear, you could always unlock the bootloader and install a custom ROM like Lineage OS for a far more recent version of Android. Probably not worth doing anymore apart from the pure novelty, since, you know, this phone is old, but hey, it's always an option. But let's turn to the cameras. One of the most standout features in the Nexus 6 design, from the back, you've got that single 13 megapixel optically stabilized sensor with this flash ring around it, very distinctly Motorola. On the front, we've got a basic 2 megapixel selfie camera. It's pretty rough, not out of the norm at all from 2014, but still pretty rough. The back camera though, it's not great, but it was good for the time, and even today, in decent lighting conditions, ideally outdoors during the day, it's capable of capturing well, decent images. Going indoors, or in any less than ideal lighting situation, and the flaws quickly become more apparent, with blurry, noisy, grainy results, but again, this is a 2014 smartphone, and that's just how these things were back then. Video can be filmed in up to 4K at 30 frames per second, which is fairly impressive numbers, though the results aren't exactly anything mind-boggling. The optical image stabilization is definitely a help across the board, however, and it was a really important inclusion to boost consistency in how images and video could turn out. You still probably do want to take multiple photos at a time to ensure one turns out properly, and that everything's in focus as you need it to be, but honestly, I feel pretty happy with a lot of these pictures. Nothing that'll blow you out of the water, but for a 2014 flagship smartphone, about exactly what you would hope for. The Nexus 6, on one hand, seems like maybe the most unique model from the Nexus line ever made, but also it's very much not. It's a Moto X with the Nexus branding, so it isn't really unique, but compared to every other Nexus, it completely stands out. Google would have two Nexus phones come out in 2015, an LG's Nexus 5X and Huawei's Nexus 6P. These phones would bridge the gap and make up for the huge hole in Google's 2014 lineup. You had a direct follow-up to the smaller Nexus 5, and then a more premium and refined version of the larger Nexus 6. The 6P would drop wireless charging, and the screen would get smaller at 5.7 inches. Still, the phone looks and feels a lot more premium, moving to an all aluminum and glass design rather than plastic. And there's the fingerprint readers, gotta love those. The bottom bezel on the Nexus 6 is thinner, which is nice, but as a whole, the 6P really did feel like a superior device, but also one that maybe was missing something. Missing some of that Motorola charm, maybe playing it a bit safe. The Nexus 6 stands out because it wasn't just big, it was really big in everything that it did. It was the ultimate non-Samsung type of Android phone that just crammed in a bunch of different things with this distinct design that could both feel cheap and premium at the same time thanks to the plastic and aluminum combination. The screen was huge and vibrant, and the experience with that clean Google software made for either the perfect user experience or a terrible one, depending on whether or not this phone was just too big for your hand. The Nexus 6 is not a phone I'd ever want to use anymore, and even if I could go back in time to 2014, I still don't think I'd choose it over some of the competition. And the Nexus 6P to me kinda blows it away, if only for the really premium design. But even so, I really respect the Nexus 6, and how unhinged Google was to completely shift gears away from their previous two Nexus models. Them jumping manufacturer to manufacturer produced a phone line that could feel immensely different year to year, and there's never been anything like it. If you had a Nexus 5X coming out alongside the Nexus 6, maybe you have a Nexus 6 from LG and then a Nexus 6 Plus from Motorola, you would basically have had the perfect Nexus line in 2014. But no, we just had this phone, and I think this phone was just a little bit too much. It always was just a bit too big. Still, the Nexus 6 was a fantastic smartphone, and it's easy to see why it built its own little cult following over the years, and I'm glad we got to give it the spotlight today. So with that, I think I'm right about done here. I hope you found this video interesting, and if you did, please hit that like button, and consider subscribing for more content just like this. We do have a Discord server with a great community if you'd like to come by and say hi, and thank you so much to the channel members for your support. You guys are the absolute best. And thank you all for watching. I am Josh from 91 Tech, and I will see you all next time.